June 6, 1944, early morning. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. The sea is black and violent beneath the shadow of stone. Waves slam into the base of sheer cliffs, rising nearly 100 feet straight into the sky. At the top, German artillery positions sit in quiet confidence, their barrels aimed toward the invasion beaches to the east. From this height, the coast feels untouchable, impassable, safe. Below, small silhouettes break through the smoke. American landing craft heave in the surf, struggling against wind, current, and enemy fire. Machine gun tracers stitch the water. Mortar explosions erupt along the rock face. Rockets scream upward and burst against concrete. For the men inside those boats, there is no cover, no retreat, only the wall in front of them. Grappling hooks arc into the darkness. Some catch, some fall back into the sea. Ropes snap under fire. Ladders shudder as bullets tear through steel rungs. Men climb anyway, hand over hand, straight into the storm above them. From the edge of the cliff, German defenders peer down in disbelief. No one had ever climbed these walls under fire. No one was supposed to try. But on this morning, the impossible is already happening. And as the first American hands reach the top, the battle for the cliffs becomes something far more dangerous for the defenders than they ever imagined. Long before the first Ranger boats were lifted and scattered by the waves beneath Pointe du Hoc, the high cliffs had already been marked as one of the most dangerous positions on the entire Normandy coast. From their summit, German artillery could dominate the narrow strip of water between the cliffs and the beaches below, and reach even farther east toward the American landing zones at Omaha and Utah. Fixed into concrete casemates were heavy 155mm guns, weapons with the range to tear into landing craft, transport ships, and troop concentrations as soon as the invasion began. If those guns remained operational, the landings on the American beaches could be crippled within minutes. For Allied planners, Pointe du Hoc became a nightmare problem, with only one solution. The guns had to be destroyed before they could fire. Air attacks were considered. Bombers could crater the area, but no one could guarantee the guns would be disabled beyond use. Naval bombardment offered greater precision, but the angles were poor and the concrete too thick. Paratroopers could not be dropped directly onto the cliffs. Conventional infantry assaults from the beach would place troops under artillery fire long before they could reach the top. The only option left was the most dangerous one. The cliffs would have to be climbed under fire. For that mission, Allied commanders selected the U.S. Army Rangers, men already trained for extreme operations, steep terrain, and independent combat. Their task was simple in language and nearly suicidal in execution. Land at the base of the cliffs, scale the vertical rock face with ropes and ladders, overrun the German positions, and destroy the guns before they could be brought into action. Every element of the plan carried risk. The tides were unpredictable. The surf was violent. The cliffs themselves were nearly vertical, with no natural paths upward. German defenders stood above with machine guns, mortars, grenades, and clear lines of sight directly down the rock face. Any man who fell would fall 100 feet into surf choked with landing craft and debris. There would be no retreat. If the Rangers failed, the Omaha and Utah landings could collapse under artillery fire. If they succeeded, they could remove one of the greatest threats to the entire American invasion. The Germans believed the cliffs solved the problem for them. Natural stone did what concrete alone could not. From the top of Pointe du Hoc, the cliff face plunged straight into deep water. The approach offered no cover, no gullies, no gradual slopes. To the defenders, it was an impossible angle, too steep for infantry, too exposed for equipment, too direct to survive. German confidence grew quietly in that belief. The Atlantic Wall was designed to make the beaches lethal. Pointe du Hoc was built to make the sea itself a killing zone. From this one position, German fire could reach far across both American landing sectors. The gunners above believed they would see the invasion coming and break it apart before the first waves could even organize. What they did not fully account for was how far the Americans were willing to push physical impossibility in the opening minutes of the war's most dangerous day. As June 1944 approached, Allied intelligence tracked the position constantly. Aerial photographs revealed bunkers, trenches, and observation posts etched into the cliff top. Each new image confirmed what planners already feared. If those guns fired freely on D-Day, men would die by the hundreds on the beaches below. And so, quietly and without publicity, the Rangers trained. They climbed under live fire. They climbed in rain. They climbed with weighted packs. They climbed with ropes slick from seawater and grease. Because on the morning the invasion began, there would be no second attempt. There would be only one chance to prove that the impossible could be forced into reality. And that moment was moving closer with every passing night. In the weeks leading up to June 1944, the men assigned to Pointe du Hoc entered a world of preparation unlike anything most of them had known before. The Rangers selected for the mission trained in secrecy along the rugged coasts of Britain. Their instructors recreated the cliffs as closely as possible. Vertical rock faces slick with seawater, rope lines whipped by wind, ladders thrown upward under simulated fire. Every climb was timed. Every movement was rehearsed. Every failure was punished by repetition. These men were taught to climb not as mountaineers, but as assault troops. One hand on the rope, one hand ready for a weapon, grenades clipped to belts, rifles slung tight to the body. They practiced hauling themselves upward while carrying explosives heavy enough to tear through reinforced concrete. They practiced cutting through wire at the top under the pressure of imaginary bullets. They practiced fighting the moment their boots touched the crest. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, understood the weight of the assignment with brutal clarity. There was no margin built into the plan. The Rangers would not be landing on a friendly beach. There would be no armor support, no immediate infantry follow-on. They would be alone on the cliff top, surrounded by German positions and expected to neutralize the most dangerous artillery threat to the entire American landing sector. Failure was not an option that could be measured in losses alone. Failure would echo across the beaches. Meanwhile, the German defenders at Pointe du Hoc lived with a very different expectation. From their position above the sea, the invasion, if it came, seemed like something that would unfold beneath them, not against them directly. Their bunkers had been built to absorb naval fire. Their observation posts had clear views of the channel. Their guns were positioned to rake the beaches below. To the German gunners, the Atlantic Wall was not just concrete and steel. It was geography itself working in their favor. The cliffs created a natural moat. The sea at their base offered no safe landing space. The heights above offered plunging fire straight down into any approaching craft. From the top, the idea of an infantry assault straight up the rock face seemed absurd. It defied every rule of conventional warfare. As spring turned into early summer, the defenders settled into that assumption. They drilled. They sharpened fields of fire. They adjusted observation angles. But they did not prepare for men climbing their walls under fire. On the night of June 5, 1944, the atmosphere at Pointe du Hoc was tense but not frantic. The weather had turned rough. Winds whipped across the channel. Clouds smothered the sky. Many German units along the coast believed the conditions would delay any major landing attempt. The sea itself seemed to argue against an invasion. Below the surface of that belief, however, Allied forces were already moving. Across the channel, thousands of ships were forming into invasion columns. Paratroopers were boarding aircraft. Naval gun crews were manning their positions. And in the darkness just offshore from Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers climbed into their small assault craft. What they faced even before reaching the cliffs was a battle of survival against water and time. The sea was violent. Waves towered over the boats. Some craft were pushed off course. Others took on water. Several rangers were thrown into the surf and pulled back aboard only at the last moment. Equipment was soaked. Explosives grew heavier with every impact against the hull. Navigation errors began to creep in. When the convoy finally reached the coastline, it was not aligned with the base of the cliffs as precisely as planned. Precious minutes were lost adjusting position in full view of the shoreline. German sentries, alerted by the swelling presence of Allied ships farther out to sea, began to awaken to the possibility that this was no longer another false alarm. As night gave way to the first gray light of dawn, the men in the ranger boats could now see the cliff rising above. German observation posts were built to track ships, not men clinging to stone. The defenders had prepared for naval bombardment and beach assaults. They had not prepared for figures rising out of the sea itself. At first, some gunners thought the movement below was wreckage tossed by the waves. Then they saw ropes. Then they saw helmets. Then they saw hands gripping rock. Machine gun crews swung barrels downward and opened fire directly along the cliff face. Grenades were thrown blindly over the edge. Loose stones were kicked free to tumble down onto the climbing men. Every attempt was made to shear the ropes, to break the ladders, to force the attackers back into the water. But the impossible refused to stop. Every time a man fell, another took his place. When a rope was cut, another was thrown upward. When a ladder shattered, a hook caught somewhere higher. The defenders were watching a violation of the battlefield logic they trusted. From the German perspective, this was supposed to be the one direction the war could not come from. Now it was coming straight at them. And with each second that passed, the confidence built into the height of the cliffs began to erode into something colder and far more dangerous. Aboard one of the pitching craft beneath the cliffs, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder watched the assault unfold under conditions he had known were possible but had never truly been able to simulate. Communications were already fragmenting. Some boats landed late. Others drifted off course. Casualties mounted before the first man reached the top. The cliff face itself was proving more difficult than training had prepared for. Slick with water, fractured by impact, obscured by smoke and falling debris. Yet Rudder could not afford to focus on loss. The guns at the top of Pointe du Hoc were the objective. Every minute they remained operational increased the danger to the landings at Omaha and Utah. The Rangers were not attacking for personal survival alone. They were attacking to remove a threat to thousands of men they would never see. Orders moved through hand signals. Runners moved between positions when radios failed. Climbing continued even when coordination dissolved into instinct and determination. Rudder was wounded early in the assault. He refused evacuation. The mission could not pause for injury. There were no reserves waiting to replace broken units. The Rangers at the base of the wall were everything the plan had committed to this single point. Failure here would not be measured in yards. It would be measured in beaches. No doctrine fully prepared either side for a battle fought straight up a cliff face. The assault at Pointe du Hoc turned gravity itself into a weapon that favored the defenders, at least on paper. The Germans held the high ground. They had plunging fire. They had clear observation. The Rangers had only the thin lines of rope they could throw upward through smoke and gunfire. Each climb became a tactical puzzle solved in seconds. Hooks had to catch into cracks invisible from below. Ladders, some borrowed from London fire brigades, had to reach without collapsing under bullet impact. When ladders shattered, ropes replaced them. When ropes were cut, more were thrown. Men timed their movement between bursts of fire. climbing during the brief half-seconds when gunners reloaded or shifted aim. There was no massed wave. The angle made that impossible. The assault came as a steady trickle, one man, then another, each carrying not only a weapon but the responsibility to secure the top for those behind him. From above, German grenades fell downward in blind arcs. From below, American rockets streaked upward and smashed into concrete. The cliff face itself became a corridor of fire. Tactically, the battle was not about ground gained. It was about continuity. As long as even one ranger kept climbing, the assault lived. The moment that flow stopped, the attack would die against the rock. Technology at Pointe du Hoc did not arrive neatly packaged in laboratory perfection. It arrived as a collection of improvised solutions pushed to their physical limits. Naval gunfire played a vital supporting role. Destroyers and larger warships offshore fired directly at the cliff top, smashing bunkers and observation posts that had been immune to most land-based weapons. Their shells did not simply damage fortifications. They disrupted German fields of fire at critical moments, creating brief openings in an otherwise lethal defensive curtain. At the same time, the Ranger assault relied on technology that was almost deceptively simple. Rocket-fired grappling hooks, fire ladders extended to their mechanical limits, explosives carried by men climbing hand over hand. These tools were not elegant, they were brutal in their function. They either worked or the men using them died before reaching the top. German expectations were built around concrete, steel, and the belief that vertical stone made infantry assault impossible. The Americans arrived with ropes, rockets, and naval guns, and proved that the combination of simple tools and overwhelming fire support could violate even the most imposing natural defenses. The battlefield was no longer defined only by walls and weapons. It was defined by what could be forced into operation under fire. For German soldiers at the top of the cliffs, the first American faces appearing over the edge carried more than immediate danger. They carried symbolic collapse. The wall they trusted had not held. The impossible had been attempted and achieved. What followed was not the controlled defense many had imagined, but close-quarters chaos inside trenches and around shattered bunkers. The advantage of height disappeared the moment enemy boots reached the summit. Now the fight became one of grenades, rifles, and speed, man against man in spaces measured by yards. Shock spread faster than bullets. Positions that had been considered secure hours earlier were now surrounded from the wrong side, attacked not from the sea, not from the beach, but from above. The psychological dimension of that reversal was immediate and devastating. For the Rangers, reaching the top was not victory. It was transition. They had climbed into the mission's most dangerous phase, fighting on ground that had been designed to kill them from below. For the Germans, the climb itself shattered a belief that had governed their defense from the beginning. The Atlantic Wall had not been outflanked. It had been climbed. Morning, June 6, 1944, the summit of Pointe du Hoc. The moment the first Rangers pulled themselves over the edge, the battle changed its shape entirely. What had been a vertical struggle against stone and gravity became a violent, close-range fight across shattered concrete and torn earth. Smoke hung low over the cliff top. Bunkers still smoldered from naval fire. Craters overlapped craters. Wire lay in tangled heaps where rockets had ripped through the defenses only minutes before. And moving through this chaos in small, fragmented groups were the first American Rangers to ever reach the summit of Pointe du Hoc under fire. They had not arrived as a unified force. Some had climbed early, some were still coming up. Others had fallen into the sea or been cut down against the rock face below. Units were scattered. Communications were broken. The carefully rehearsed phases of the assault had dissolved almost instantly into instinct and determination. But one objective still governed everything: the guns. Every ranger on the cliff knew why they were there. The 155mm coastal artillery that had threatened the Omaha and Utah landings was supposed to be fixed in concrete casements near the edge. If those guns fired freely, the beaches below could be plunged into catastrophe even after the first waves had landed. So the Rangers moved fast. They cleared trenches with grenades. They kicked in steel doors. They pushed through smoke-choked corridors inside shattered bunkers. German defenders, shocked by the sudden appearance of enemy troops from above, fought fiercely but without cohesion. Some positions resisted briefly. Others collapsed as soon as Americans entered from unexpected angles. Then came the moment that stunned even the attackers. The main gun emplacements were empty. The concrete casements stood where the recon photographs had shown them. Their pits were intact. Their protective walls were scorched by bombardment. But the guns themselves were gone. Not destroyed, not buried, simply removed. For a brief, terrifying span of minutes, the mission's entire purpose seemed to evaporate. If the guns were gone, where were they? The answer mattered more than the cliff itself. Somewhere inland, those weapons could already be positioned to fire on the beaches. Ours could decide the fate of entire divisions still landing below. Without waiting for orders that couldn't reach them, small ranger patrols broke away from the summit and pushed inland across the narrow plateau behind the cliffs. They moved through hedgerows and shell holes, cutting through German communities.
By afternoon on D-Day, the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc had achieved what no one had believed possible. They had climbed the cliffs. They had overrun the summit. They had found and destroyed the hidden guns. But victory, in its pure sense, did not arrive with relief. It arrived with isolation. German forces surrounding the position began to regroup with deliberate intent. Units from nearby strongpoints filtered inward. Machine gun teams re-established interlocking fire. Mortar crews walked their rounds closer with each passing minute. What had been shock in the morning hardened into organized resistance by evening. The Rangers were now surrounded on three sides. Supply was their first crisis. Most of the radios had been lost in the climb. Ammunition was already dangerously low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Many men were wounded and could not be evacuated. There was no inland force yet strong enough to link up with the cliff top. Naval support, once decisive, became difficult to coordinate without reliable communication. And still, the Germans came. Small counterattacks probed the Ranger perimeter throughout the afternoon. Some were repelled with rifle fire and grenades. Others forced brutal, close-quarters fighting inside trenches and cratered fortifications. Positions changed hands more than once. No line stayed fixed for long. The Rangers fought not with the advantage of numbers, but with the advantage of refusal. They refused to abandon the summit. They refused to yield the position back to the defenders who had lost it in disbelief only hours earlier. Every yard was paid for with exhaustion, shock, and dwindling supplies. As night fell on June 6, the situation darkened in every sense. Darkness cut visibility to yards. German patrols moved through the shattered landscape, feeling for gaps. The Rangers listened for footsteps in the ruins. Wounded men lay between positions, unable to move. Their survival dependent on whether they could be reached before the next attack. In the early hours of June 7, a major German counterattack struck. Infantry pressed in under mortar fire. Machine guns raked the Ranger lines from multiple angles. Several positions were nearly overrun. Men fought with rifles, pistols, knives, and bare hands in pockets of fighting that lasted minutes and felt like hours.
At one point, only a handful of Rangers remained standing at a critical trench line. They held it not because they were reinforced, but because there was nowhere left to fall back to. They held it because retreat meant the cliffs would fall back into German hands, and that, after everything that had been paid to take them, was unthinkable. By the morning of June 7, the Ranger force had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Casualties mounted. Ammunition was rationed by handfuls. Every man remaining on the summit was fighting on borrowed endurance. Then, from the east, the sound of heavy fighting began to change. Gunfire drew closer, not in isolation, but in volume. American forces from Omaha, after battling their way off the beach and through German positions inland, were approaching the Pointe du Hoc area. Their advance was slow and costly, but it was steady. For the first time since the Rangers had climbed the cliffs, the pressure from the inland side began to ease. By late June 7, elements of the American infantry finally broke through to the summit. The linkage was not marked by cheers or celebration. It came in the quiet recognition that the impossible position had been held long enough for the larger invasion to absorb it. Of the few hundred Rangers who had begun the assault, less than half were still capable of fighting. Nearly every surviving man was wounded, exhausted, or shattered by the strain of 2 days without relief. And yet, the mission was complete. The guns were destroyed. The cliffs were held. The threat to the American beaches was permanently removed. Across the Normandy coast, the invasion continued to expand into a foothold that would soon become a front and then a liberation. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc had removed one of the sharpest blades aimed at the heart of that operation. They had not ended the battle with a charge. They had ended it by enduring what came after the impossible. June-July 1944. The cost of the cliffs. When the American infantry finally secured a firm connection to the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, what they found on the summit was not a triumphant stronghold. It was a battlefield stripped raw by exhaustion, injury, and the silent weight of survival. Of the 225 Rangers who launched the climb on the morning of June 6, fewer than 100 remained capable of fighting by the time relief arrived. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Some lay in collapsed trenches. Others had fallen along the cliff face or drowned beneath the surf at the base of the rock. The cliffs had been taken, but only by consuming nearly half the force assigned to them. The German defenders had suffered deeply as well. The strong points at Pointe du Hoc were shattered beyond operational value. The artillery threat that had once dominated the western edge of Omaha Beach no longer existed. The entire coastal battery system in that sector collapsed as an effective fighting force. With the guns destroyed inland and the summit secured by U.S. forces, Pointe du Hoc ceased to function as a German artillery position. Its role in the Atlantic Wall ended permanently within 48 hours of the first climb. For the broader Normandy campaign, the meaning was immediate and strategic. Omaha Beach, already on the edge of disaster in the early hours, was spared the devastating direct artillery fire that the point howitzers were designed to deliver. Instead of plunging barrages from above, German fire on Omaha remained fragmented and localized. This did not eliminate American losses, which were still severe, but it prevented a much more catastrophic suppression of the landing zones. The consequences extended far beyond a single cliff. With the Atlantic Wall breached not just at the beaches, but at its most formidable natural barriers, German defensive doctrine in Normandy unraveled. The belief that concrete and geography alone could stop the invasion evaporated under the reality of American combined arms, naval fire, infantry assault, engineers, and airborne forces acting in coordinated rupture. For the Rangers themselves, the aftermath unfolded quietly. Many were evacuated within days due to wounds. Others remained in combat for subsequent operations in France. The men who walked off the cliffs carried injuries that ranged from physical to psychological. Shrapnel wounds, broken bones, concussions, and the invisible aftershocks of days spent isolated under constant attack. Illusions of invincibility did not follow them. What followed instead was a recognition shared by veterans across Normandy that survival on D-Day was often decided in margins measured in seconds and inches. From German command reports captured after the invasion, Pointe du Hoc appeared repeatedly as a symbol of shock, not merely for its tactical loss, but for what it represented. The cliffs had been considered naturally impregnable. Their fall from below shattered confidence in several surrounding strongpoints almost immediately. The sense that the sea-facing defenses could be trusted no longer held. For the German infantrymen farther inland, the message was grimly clear. If the cliffs could fall, nothing on the coast was safe. As June turned into July, the invasion hardened into a front. New American divisions poured into Normandy. Artificial harbors expanded. Supply depots multiplied. And with each passing day, the consequences of Pointe du Hoc shifted from immediate battlefield relief into long-term strategic certainty. The coastal gateway into France was no longer merely open. It was permanent. And that permanence would soon demand a larger reckoning. Summer through autumn 1944, from the cliffs to the collapse of Germany's Western Front. The fall of Pointe du Hoc did not echo through newspapers on June 7. There were no parades, no victory speeches. Its importance unfolded quietly, folded into the larger machinery of the Normandy breakout. But among commanders on both sides, the meaning was unmistakable. A position once believed unassailable had fallen to infantry assault alone. For the Allies, Pointe du Hoc became a proof of concept for something larger than one mission. It validated the core logic of the invasion itself, that no segment of the Atlantic Wall, no matter how heavily fortified or naturally defended, was immune to rupture when air, naval, and ground power are synchronized. The cliffs were not simply seized, they were invalidated as a defensive idea. German doctrine along the Normandy coast had leaned heavily on immovable defenses, concrete, steel, elevation, and geography. Pointe du